What most people misunderstand about narcissistic behavior is that narcissists are not primarily obsessed with love, connection, or even admiration. Those things matter to them, but only because they create access to control. Control is the real addiction. Emotional leverage is the real currency. And the moment a narcissist senses that you are emotionally independent, that you can think for yourself, regulate yourself, and walk away if necessary, you immediately become psychologically dangerous to them. That's the part people rarely talk about. A narcissist is not deeply threatened by someone who hates them. They can work with hatred. Hatred is emotional attachment. Anger is attachment. Obsession is attachment. Even constant arguing still keeps the narcissist psychologically relevant in your mind. But emotional independence, calm detachment, the ability to exist without needing their approval, that creates panic in them because it removes their influence over your internal state. And this is why some of the strongest people often become the biggest targets. A psychologically strong person carries a kind of invisible resistance. They may still be empathetic. They may still care deeply about people, but underneath that empathy is a stable sense of self. Their identity is not entirely built on external validation. They can tolerate disagreement. They can tolerate loneliness. They can tolerate being misunderstood without collapsing emotionally. To a narcissist, that kind of person feels uncontrollable. Now here's where the manipulation becomes subtle. In the beginning, narcissists are often highly attracted to emotionally grounded people because strength provides emotional supply. It gives them someone impressive to attach themselves to, but eventually admiration turns into resentment. Why? Because every narcissist unconsciously measures power through emotional dependency. The more you need them, the safer they feel. The less you need them, the more anxious they become. This is why narcissists often test people early. They create small emotional disruptions just to study your reaction. Maybe they withdraw attention for no reason. Maybe they become unusually cold after intimacy. Maybe they subtly disrespect a boundary to see whether you defend yourself or abandon your standards to maintain harmony. They are collecting psychological data. They are trying to answer one question: can this person be controlled emotionally? And if the answer becomes no, the relationship often shifts. You'll notice that the narcissist becomes more strategic once they realize your confidence is genuine. The manipulation stops being obvious and starts becoming psychological. They may begin planting self-doubt slowly rather than attacking directly. They may create emotional inconsistency because confusion weakens clarity. A clear-minded person is difficult to manipulate, but an emotionally exhausted person becomes easier to influence. And this is the deeper truth most people miss. Narcissists do not fear strong emotions nearly as much as they fear stable identities, because a stable identity cannot be easily rewritten. A person who knows who they are becomes very difficult to psychologically destabilize. They may feel pain, but they do not lose themselves inside the pain. And narcissists depend on identity destabilization. They need you questioning your value, your perception, your memory, your worth. The moment you remain internally anchored, their tactics lose effectiveness. This is also why emotionally independent people often notice a strange escalation after setting healthy boundaries. They think, why did things get worse after I became stronger? Because strength exposes manipulation. Boundaries expose intentions. And when a narcissist realizes the old methods no longer work, they often escalate into more covert forms of control: guilt, victimhood, silent treatment, social manipulation, or emotional confusion. Not because you are weak, because you are becoming unavailable to psychological ownership. And that is the narcissist's greatest fear: not abandonment, not rejection, but irrelevance. The possibility that someone can fully see them, understand the game, and still choose inner peace over emotional captivity. The moment you stop needing permission to trust yourself, the narcissist begins losing access to your mind. One of the most dangerous things a narcissist can do is not scream at you, insult you, or openly attack you. Those behaviors are obvious. Obvious manipulation is easier to detect. The real psychological damage usually happens through something much quieter: reality distortion. And this is the dirty trick that confuses even highly intelligent people because it doesn't feel like manipulation at first. It feels like uncertainty. The narcissist slowly turns your own mind into a courtroom where every thought you have is forced to defend itself. At the beginning, the contradictions are small. They deny saying something they clearly said. They rewrite the emotional tone of a conversation you remember vividly. They subtly imply that your reaction is irrational while ignoring the behavior that caused it. And because emotionally healthy people naturally self-reflect, you start examining yourself before questioning them. That's the trap. Psychologically strong people are often targeted through their strengths. If you're introspective, your introspection gets weaponized against you. If you're empathetic, your empathy becomes a tool for manipulation. If you value fairness, you begin overcorrecting your own behavior while the narcissist quietly avoids accountability altogether. And over time, something dangerous happens. Your certainty starts dissolving. You begin replaying conversations repeatedly in your head. You start thinking things like, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Now understand what's happening psychologically here. The narcissist is not simply trying to win arguments. They are trying to weaken your trust in your own perception. Because once a person stops trusting themselves internally, they become highly influenceable externally. This is why reality distortion is so effective. Human beings need cognitive stability. We need to feel that our thoughts, memories, and emotional experiences have coherence. When someone repeatedly disrupts that coherence, the brain enters a state of psychological fatigue. You stop focusing on truth and start focusing on relief. You just want the tension to end. And that's often the exact moment people begin surrendering their boundaries. The narcissist understands something most people don't consciously recognize. Confusion creates dependency. A confused mind looks for guidance. A destabilized person becomes easier to control because they no longer feel anchored in their own judgment. This is why narcissists often alternate between affection and invalidation. One moment they reassure you, the next they subtly dismantle your confidence. The inconsistency itself is strategic. The human brain becomes obsessed with resolving unpredictable emotional patterns. And this creates what psychologists sometimes call intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism behind gambling addiction. The uncertainty keeps you emotionally engaged. You start chasing clarity the way gamblers chase certainty. But clarity never fully comes because the confusion is intentional. What makes this especially dangerous is that narcissists rarely distort reality in completely unbelievable ways. They mix truth with manipulation. They take one small flaw you genuinely have and magnify it until you begin viewing yourself primarily through weakness. They exploit moments where you made mistakes and use those moments as evidence that your overall perception cannot be trusted. And eventually, people lose connection with their instincts. You'll notice victims of prolonged manipulation often become hesitant in ordinary situations. They apologize excessively. They over-explain simple decisions. They seek reassurance before trusting their own conclusions. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when someone has been psychologically conditioned to distrust themselves over time. The terrifying part is that this process often happens gradually enough that the victim doesn't notice the transformation while it's occurring. And this is why emotionally intelligent people can remain trapped longer than expected. Intelligence alone does not protect someone from manipulation. In fact, highly analytical people sometimes become easier to trap because they believe every problem can be solved through understanding. So they keep analyzing the narcissist, hoping insight will restore stability. But narcissistic manipulation is not built on misunderstanding. It is built on control. You cannot logically solve a psychological game designed to keep you psychologically off balance. The turning point comes when a person stops asking, "How do I prove my reality?" and starts asking, "Why am I defending my reality to someone committed to distorting it?" That question changes everything. Because the moment you stop seeking validation for your perception, your mind begins reconnecting with its natural clarity. And clarity is dangerous to manipulators. A person who trusts their own perception becomes almost impossible to psychologically own. One of the clearest signs that a narcissist feels threatened by you is that the conflict suddenly stops being private. The moment they realize they can no longer control your emotions directly, they often begin trying to control how other people see you. And this is where the manipulation becomes especially calculated because reputation is deeply tied to human survival psychology. Human beings are social creatures. Our nervous system is wired to care about belonging, acceptance, and social perception. Narcissists understand this instinctively. They know that if they cannot destabilize your identity internally, they may still be able to destabilize your position socially. So instead of confronting you directly, they begin shaping narratives around you. And the disturbing part is that they rarely do this in obvious ways. They do it through implication, through tone, through selective storytelling. through carefully edited versions of events that make them appear wounded, misunderstood, or patient while subtly casting you as unstable, cold, selfish, or emotionally difficult. They understand that people are often persuaded more by emotional framing than objective facts. This is why narcissists often begin building their defense long before you realize there's even a war happening. They may start planting tiny seeds in conversations with mutual friends or family members. Small comments that sound harmless on the surface. I'm worried about them lately. They've just been acting different. I try so hard to communicate, but nothing works. Notice the strategy here. They avoid direct accusations initially because indirect manipulation feels more believable. It creates the illusion of concern rather than control. And what they're really doing is preparing the social environment in advance. Because narcissists think strategically about perception, they understand that if they can influence how people interpret your future reactions, they gain psychological leverage. Then later, when you finally become frustrated, emotional, or exhausted from the manipulation, your reactions appear to confirm the story they already planted. This is one of the dirtiest psychological tactics narcissists use against strong people. They provoke emotional reactions privately while protecting their image publicly. So the target ends up living two separate realities. In private, they experience manipulation, invalidation, disrespect, and confusion. But publicly, the narcissist appears calm, caring, reasonable, even generous. And this split reality creates enormous psychological pressure because the victim begins feeling unseen and socially isolated. Now, here's what makes strong people especially vulnerable to this dynamic. Strong individuals often assume truth naturally reveals itself over time. They believe authenticity eventually speaks for itself. And morally, that's an admirable way to live. But narcissists exploit this assumption because they understand something uncomfortable about human psychology. People often believe the first emotionally convincing narrative they hear, especially if it's delivered calmly. And narcissists are often highly skilled at emotional presentation. They know how to appear composed while quietly provoking chaos behind the scenes. They may even perform vulnerability publicly because vulnerability creates trust rapidly. But their vulnerability is often strategic rather than authentic. It is designed to recruit sympathy, allies, and social protection. This is also why victims frequently feel shocked when others don't immediately understand what's happening. They think, if people could just see what I see, they would understand. But manipulation is rarely designed to be visible. If it were obvious, it wouldn't work. The narcissist's real objective is not necessarily to destroy your reputation completely. Sometimes the goal is simply to create enough doubt around you that your confidence begins weakening. If people question your emotional stability, your motives, or your credibility, you may start over-explaining yourself, defending yourself constantly, or trying to prove your goodness. And once again, the narcissist has succeeded in pulling your attention away from your inner stability and into external validation. That's the game. They want you psychologically occupied, distracted, reactive, emotionally consumed by perception management instead of personal clarity. But eventually, emotionally mature people learn something powerful. Not every false narrative requires a defense. Trying to control every opinion people have about you is another form of psychological captivity. Because once your peace depends on universal understanding, you become vulnerable to anyone willing to distort perception. And this is why narcissists become frustrated when they can no longer bait you into defending your character endlessly. Silence, consistency, and emotional stability eventually expose manipulation more effectively than emotional warfare ever could. Because over time, truth does something manipulation cannot do. It remains coherent. And people who know who they are stop chasing approval from audiences trained to misunderstand them. One of the most psychologically confusing experiences with a narcissist is not the conflict itself. It's the sudden absence of connection. One day they are emotionally present, attentive, affectionate, engaged, and then without warning something shifts. The warmth disappears. The communication changes. The energy becomes cold, distant, almost unfamiliar. And what makes this tactic so effective is that it creates emotional whiplash. Human beings are wired to search for patterns. We instinctively try to understand changes in behavior, especially from people we care about. So when someone suddenly withdraws emotionally without explanation, the mind automatically begins searching for meaning. Did I do something wrong? Did I miss a signal? Are they hurt? This internal questioning is exactly what gives the narcissist psychological leverage. Because the silence is rarely accidental. For emotionally healthy people, temporary withdrawal is sometimes natural. People need space. People experience stress, fatigue, emotional overload, but narcissistic withdrawal often carries a different psychological texture. It feels calculated because it usually appears immediately after intimacy, vulnerability, closeness, or emotional progress. The moment connection deepens, the narcissist abruptly pulls away, and that sudden emotional absence creates anxiety. Now understand what's happening beneath the surface psychologically. The narcissist is studying your reaction to emotional deprivation. They want to know how quickly your nervous system destabilizes when access to their attention disappears. Because attention, affection, and validation are not just emotional experiences in these relationships, they become conditioning tools. This is why many people describe narcissistic relationships as addictive. The addiction is not necessarily to the person themselves, it's to the emotional cycle. Connection followed by withdrawal, reward followed by uncertainty, presence followed by silence. The brain becomes trapped trying to restore emotional equilibrium. And once someone begins chasing emotional consistency, the power dynamic changes. The narcissist now becomes the perceived source of emotional relief. That's what makes the silent treatment and emotional withdrawal so manipulative. It trains the other person to associate peace with regaining the narcissist's approval or attention. Over time, people begin abandoning their own boundaries just to end the emotional discomfort. And here's the disturbing part. Strong people often rationalize this behavior longer than others. Because emotionally mature individuals tend to give people grace. They don't immediately assume manipulation. They think, maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they need space. Maybe I should be more understanding. And while compassion is healthy, narcissists often exploit that compassion strategically. The emotionally strong person keeps approaching the situation with empathy while the narcissist approaches it with psychological calculation. So the stronger person slowly becomes emotionally exhausted trying to repair a connection that is being destabilized intentionally. You'll notice something else too. The narcissist's withdrawal is often selective. They may appear emotionally available to others while becoming unusually distant specifically toward you. This creates even deeper confusion because now you're comparing realities. You think, how can they be warm with everyone else but cold with me? And that comparison intensifies self-doubt. But the withdrawal is not always about punishing you. Sometimes it's about testing your dependency. The narcissist unconsciously wants proof that they still control your emotional state. So they create absence to see whether you panic, chase, over-explain, apologize, or emotionally collapse. And if you do, the withdrawal temporarily ends because the narcissist has received reassurance of their psychological influence. This is why emotional withdrawal often repeats in cycles. It's reinforcement conditioning. The pattern itself becomes the control mechanism. Now, philosophically, this reveals something deeper about unhealthy attachment dynamics. Many people confuse love with emotional intensity, but intensity is not always connection. Sometimes intensity is nervous system instability disguised as passion. Real connection creates safety, clarity, consistency, and mutual emotional responsibility. Manipulation creates confusion, unpredictability, and emotional dependency. And eventually, healing begins when a person stops interpreting withdrawal as proof of their inadequacy. Because emotionally grounded people understand something powerful. Someone else's inability to maintain healthy connection is not evidence that you are difficult to love. Sometimes the withdrawal has nothing to do with your worth at all. Sometimes it is simply the behavior of a person who only feels powerful when someone else feels emotionally uncertain. The moment you stop chasing disappearing affection, the manipulation begins losing its grip. Because genuine love does not require you to earn basic emotional stability through anxiety, confusion, or self-abandonment. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in narcissistic relationships is that the narcissist is often not trying to avoid emotional explosions, they are trying to manufacture them. That sounds counterintuitive at first because narcissists frequently present themselves as victims of other people's emotional reactions. They'll say things like, "You're too sensitive," or "You're always overreacting," or "I can't even talk to you anymore." But what many people fail to recognize is that these reactions are often the result of prolonged psychological provocation. The narcissist creates the pressure, then condemns the release of that pressure. And this is one of the most effective manipulation tactics because it reverses visibility. The audience usually sees the reaction, not the buildup. They see the moment you finally snap, raise your voice, shut down emotionally, or become visibly frustrated. What they don't see are the hundreds of small dismissals, contradictions, interruptions, invalidations, and subtle acts of disrespect that slowly push the nervous system into overload. This is why strong people often feel deeply confused after emotional conflict with narcissists. They think, that's not who I am. And usually they're right. The reaction was not their identity. It was the nervous system reaching its threshold after sustained psychological tension. Now understand the deeper strategy behind this. A narcissist often needs emotional evidence that shifts attention away from their own behavior. If they can provoke you into reacting emotionally, they can redirect the conversation from what they did to how you reacted. Suddenly, the discussion is no longer about manipulation, disrespect, or dishonesty. Now the focus becomes your tone, your anger, your frustration, your delivery. And once the conversation shifts there, the narcissist regains control. This is why they often provoke indirectly rather than directly. The manipulation is subtle enough to remain deniable. A small sarcastic comment, a dismissive facial expression, repeated interruptions, pretending not to understand obvious concerns, calmly invalidating your emotional experience while appearing rational on the surface. Each behavior alone seems minor, but psychologically they accumulate. The narcissist is essentially trying to create emotional erosion, and because emotionally intelligent people value self-control, they often tolerate far more than they should before reacting. They keep trying to remain patient, understanding, mature, and composed. But eventually, even psychologically strong people experience nervous system fatigue. The body cannot remain under constant emotional tension forever without eventually demanding release. Then comes the trap. The moment you finally react, the narcissist behaves as though your reaction emerged in isolation. They erase the context completely. They become calm the instant you become emotional. This is important because emotional contrast creates perceptual advantage. The calmer person is often perceived as more credible socially, regardless of who initiated the dysfunction. So now the narcissist appears reasonable while you appear unstable. And this can become incredibly damaging psychologically because the target begins focusing excessively on managing their reactions instead of recognizing the manipulation that created those reactions. They become ashamed of their emotional responses. They start thinking, maybe I really am the problem. Meanwhile, the narcissist quietly avoids accountability altogether. This is why emotional self-regulation is so important, not because your emotions are wrong, but because narcissists weaponize emotional reactions strategically. Now, this does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It does not mean suppressing anger or pretending pain doesn't exist. Healthy anger is a signal. Frustration is information. The goal is not emotional absence. The goal is emotional sovereignty, the ability to experience emotion without surrendering control of your identity to it. Because narcissists often rely on reactive behavior to maintain psychological dominance. If they can pull you into constant emotional chaos, they keep you operating from survival mode rather than clarity. And survival mode narrows perception. People become reactive instead of reflective. They defend themselves impulsively. They lose strategic thinking. That's exactly where the narcissist wants them. But emotionally grounded people eventually recognize something transformative. Not every provocation deserves participation. Sometimes the strongest response is refusing to emotionally perform on command. Refusing to explain yourself endlessly. Refusing to enter circular arguments designed to exhaust you. Calm detachment frustrates manipulators because it denies them emotional material to weaponize. And over time, this becomes true power, not controlling others, but controlling access to your own nervous system. Because when someone can no longer provoke you into abandoning yourself emotionally, they lose one of their most effective tools of control. At a certain point in every psychologically manipulative relationship, a person reaches a crossroads, not externally but internally. And the question quietly becomes this: how much of my life am I going to spend trying to convince someone to see me accurately? That question changes everything because it forces you to confront a painful truth most people avoid for years. The narcissist often understood you far more clearly than you realized. They simply benefited more from distorting you than understanding you honestly. That realization is difficult because emotionally healthy people assume misunderstanding is the problem. They think clarity will solve everything. They believe if they can just explain themselves correctly, communicate more calmly, provide enough evidence, enough empathy, enough patience, the relationship will stabilize. But manipulation survives through one powerful mechanism. It keeps you psychologically engaged in proving your reality. That's the trap. The narcissist doesn't always need you to believe the distortion completely. They just need you emotionally occupied by it. Defending yourself, explaining yourself, replaying conversations, trying to repair perceptions, trying to earn fairness from someone who quietly profits from imbalance. And eventually, exhausted people begin mistaking self-defense for connection. They spend more time justifying their humanity than actually living their lives. This is why true psychological freedom begins the moment you stop needing universal understanding. Because as long as your peace depends on everyone seeing your intentions accurately, you remain emotionally vulnerable to manipulation. Someone can always distort you. Someone can always misrepresent you. Someone can always misunderstand you intentionally. Emotionally mature people eventually realize something profound. Clarity is internal before it is external. In other words, the goal is not controlling every narrative about you. The goal is remaining connected to your own reality, even when false narratives exist. That is an entirely different form of strength. And ironically, narcissists struggle deeply against people who possess this kind of grounded self-awareness because manipulation depends heavily on external validation. If your identity can only survive when others constantly confirm it, then your identity remains fragile. But when a person truly knows themselves, something shifts psychologically. They stop reacting impulsively to every accusation. They stop over-explaining their motives. They stop chasing closure from people committed to confusion. And this doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from internal stability. Now, this is important because many people misunderstand emotional detachment. They think detachment means becoming cold, cynical, or emotionally unavailable. But healthy detachment is not emotional numbness. It's the ability to protect your inner clarity from psychological contamination. You can care about people without surrendering your nervous system to them. You can love someone without allowing them unrestricted access to your self-worth. And perhaps most importantly, you can walk away from distorted relationships without needing the other person to validate why you left. That level of emotional independence terrifies narcissistic personalities because it removes the foundation of control. They can no longer bait you with guilt, confusion, approval, or misunderstanding. Your emotional center stops revolving around their perception of you, and this is usually the moment narcissists become most frustrated. Not when you argue, not when you cry, not even when you confront them. What truly unsettles manipulative people is calm indifference to the game itself. When they realize you no longer need to win the argument, expose them publicly, or force accountability from them in order to move forward psychologically, they lose their leverage. Because the game only works if you keep playing. Philosophically, this reflects one of the deepest truths about human freedom. Suffering expands when identity becomes dependent on external interpretation. The more desperately we need to be understood, admired, approved of, or vindicated, the easier we become to emotionally control. But when identity becomes internally anchored, manipulation begins collapsing under its own weight. And this does not mean people stop feeling pain. Strong people still feel betrayal. They still feel grief. They still feel disappointment. But they stop building their identity around those experiences. They stop allowing someone else's dysfunction to define their relationship with themselves. That is the real transformation. Not becoming harder, becoming clearer. Because eventually you realize peace was never hidden inside the narcissist's apology, validation, or understanding. Peace begins the moment you stop asking manipulative people for permission to trust your own mind.